in February, what's the next slide? And okay. In February of 1951, excuse me, in September of 1951, which was, as you can see, the date of the Japanese Peace Conference in San Francisco was September of 1951, 60 years ago. Communist China was engaged in a major war with the United Nations on the Korean Peninsula. Virtually all of the Allied combatants that signed the peace treaty in 1951 were fighting Communist China. Certainly they didn't want the Communist Chinese to come. Of course, the Soviets argued that Chiang Kai-shek doesn't represent China, so no sense in inviting Chiang Kai-shek to come. So there were no Chinese delegation was invited. In truth, however, the United States did not want Chiang Kai-shek to come. And one of the reasons is because of this. On the morning of March 3rd, 1946, President Truman sat down to his coffee and read the newspapers. And this was the front page of the Washington Daily News of March 3rd, 1946. No, 46. This is 1946. Chinese exploit Formosa worse than Japs did. So 3 months after the United States had given Chiang Kai-shek the order to occupy Taiwan, we were getting this kind of report from Taiwan, that Chiang Kai-shek government was riddled with corruption, they were riddled with maladministration, they were destroying basically a territory that the United States felt, well, you know, we really liberated. Now, Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese did not liberate Taiwan. You know, we defeated Japan and we were liberating Taiwan. And look at the way they deal with it. This went on for another month, another 12 months. It got worse. And on February 28, 1947, it blew up into an island-wide insurrection. And I think if we move to the next slide, you can see that this was not a trivial affair. The entire island of Taiwan was engulfed in demonstrations, in riots, in just anger against the kind of administration that Chiang Kai-shek had forced on. And so the United States said, well, you know, we can't countenance this. What's the next slide here? On March 17, 1947, a week and a half or 2 weeks after the February 28th incident, the U.S. ambassador in China, Stewart, was sending a telegram to the United States State Department saying, the situation in Formosa typifies trends in China, which our association with could well become a matter of serious national embarrassment. In other words, the way Chiang Kai-shek was not just treating Formosa, but Formosa was emblematic. The way Chiang Kai-shek was even dealing with China was an embarrassment to the United States. Next slide, please. On April 11th of 1947, this is after the Ambassador Stewart's telegram, Secretary of State Acheson then made this clear to the U.S. Senate. He sent a formal letter to Senator Ball of North Carolina saying that the transfer of sovereignty over Formosa to China has not yet been formalized. So this already, you know, before the, well before the peace treaty and immediately after 228, the Secretary of State of the United States was so embarrassed that he made the point to the U.S. Senate that as far as the U.S. was concerned, sovereignty had not been transferred to China. Now that remained the position of the United States and the State Department as they began to draft a proposed peace treaty with Japan in 1949. Earlier drafts of the peace treaty included returning Formosa and the pescadores to China. And as you can see here, this is the first draft that went from the State Department to the U.S. Senior, SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers in Tokyo. And it said, this line, the allocation is indicated on the map as president. Japan hereby cedes to China in full sovereignty the island of Taiwan, Formosa, and the adjacent minor islands. And when this arrived in Japan, in Tokyo, it's General MacArthur's headquarters in November of 1949, Bill Sebald, MacArthur's top diplomat, said, MacArthur suggests considering trusteeship for Taiwan after a plebiscite. And then I think when they sent the formal telegram, I picked this out of the U.S. archives. I went down to the archives 3 weeks ago and was going through all the files. There were 179,000 books there, and I pulled them all out and looked at each one. And there it was. It was in Sebald's own handwriting. And sure enough, the telegram that went to the State Department said, Article 4, presumably security provisions will affect eventual determination Taiwan and adjacent islands. But we suggest consideration of the question of trusteeship for Taiwan consequent upon the plebiscite. What this means is that the headquarters in Tokyo wanted Taiwan to have the same status as Okinawa had. They were just going to turn it over to a U.S. military government, and we were just going to take it over from there because, frankly, the whole thing was an embarrassment, and China was collapsing. This was on, actually, November 19th of 1949, and 10 days later, Chiang Kai-shek abandoned China and moved his entire regime to Taiwan. I have to say, though, that in January of 1950, just a couple of months later, which is to say six weeks later, the United States was so upset with Chiang Kai-shek. There were stories from mainland China that maybe the communists weren't that bad. And the Truman administration basically said, look, let's just stay away from this. Let's just let the communists take over Taiwan. Because they can't be any worse than Chiang Kai-shek. And on January 12th of 1950, and I looked all over for it, I should have tried harder, there was a January 12th of 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson gave a speech to the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. that was covered, I think the next slide might be that was covered in all of the newspapers, and this one is the New York Times, but I looked, and it's also the Washington Post, it was in the San Francisco Examiner, it was in the... Acheson said, look, our defense perimeter in the Far East really does not include Taiwan. And we know that the Chinese communists are going to amass an invasion and take over Taiwan, but, you know, frankly, can't be any worse. By May 18th, 1950, so Chiang Kai-shek was already collapsing in Taiwan even, the U.S. announced plans to evacuate 220 official Americans from Formosa to Okinawa. And I don't, do I have that? Maybe? No, I don't. Anyway. And basically, regardless of Formosa's international legal status, you know, as far as the U.S. is concerned, when the communists took over Taiwan, possession would be 9 points of the law, and they could have it. You know, we're not going to argue over it at this point. And then, of course, a miracle happened. Now, I'm not sure if it was a miracle for the Taiwanese people or a miracle for Chiang Kai-shek, but the Korean War broke out. And as soon as the Korean War broke out, Dean Acheson and President Truman basically said, oh my God, we can't let Taiwan go at this point. And they brought out the same, you know, the previous, 6 months earlier, the previous decision. Nobody has affected the return of sovereignty over Taiwan to Chiang Kai-shek. We're certainly not going to give it to the communists, but we can't give it to Chiang Kai-shek either. So basically the United States position was the actual status of the island of Taiwan is that of a territory taken from Japan by the victory of the Allied forces in the Pacific. Like other such territories, its legal status cannot be fixed until there is international action to determine its future. the Chinese government was asked by the Allies, this is Chiang Kai-shek's government, was asked by the Allies to surrender, to take the surrender of the Japanese forces on the island, and that is the reason the Chinese are there now. The United States then repeated this to the United Nations on September 20th of 1950, and again in November of 1950, and again in December of 1950. And it's important because in December of 1950, at this point, the Communist Chinese had already entered the war in Korea. And that, I think, sort of clinched the deal. On March 29th of 1951, during the heat of the most brutal battles in the Korean War, I mean, you all are too young. Well, maybe not, some of you aren't too young. But, you know, the Korean War from January 1951 to May of 1951 was the most brutal battles of the entire war. In March 29, 1951, the United States then presented its draft of the peace treaty with Japan to the other signatories, including the Soviet Union. And the British also had their draft, and the US and the British, you know, reconciled their drafts. But part of the draft was that we would not determine the fate of Taiwan. The Soviet Union then complained. They said, wait a minute, the Cairo Declaration, which is the primary document outlining the aims of the Pacific War, directly stated that the island of Taiwan and the pescadores should be returned to China. This is literally what the Soviets said. Do I have that next, or is that? Maybe the next one here. The Soviets said, Cairo Declaration directly stated that the island of Taiwan and the pescadores should be returned to China. The Soviet Union sent that letter not just to the UN, but to the Secretary of State. Next one is, on May 19th, we responded. We said, well, you know, the Cairo Declaration provided that Manchuria, Formosa, and the pescadores should be returned to the Republic of China. And then the US delegate, in writing, said, the Soviet government fails to quote accurately the Cairo Declaration. The word China is substituted for the Republic of China. Next slide. Then he says, the United States inquires of the government of the Soviet Union whether it in fact now desires Formosa and the pescadores should be returned to the Republic of China. At which point the Soviets said, well, they complained about it afterwards, but you get my point. The point is that when the Soviets were said, well, look, if you want to stick by the Cairo Declaration, then you have to agree that it goes to the Republic of China. And if you don't like that, then shut the hell, excuse me, shut up. Okay. I've got one more minute left, and I've got, I hope you all have questions. This, of course, did not end the matter. I will say that next, as we mentioned, the San Francisco Peace Treaty did not address the issue of sovereignty over Taiwan. The United Kingdom representative said, as far as we're concerned, this issue does not address the matter of sovereignty over Taiwan. It remains unsettled. Canada's representative said it remains unsettled. Australia's representative says it remained unsettled. Of course, the United States said many times it remains unsettled. It was unsettled. About 2 years later, actually, there was the tensions in the Pacific did not end with the ending of the Korean War. There, of course, were several Formosa Straits crises, one of which was in 1955, the Dachen Islands crisis. And when the Chinese minister, when I say the Chinese, the Republic of China minister from Taipei, Wellington Koo was the ambassador, George Chao, came to Washington to discuss what would happen in the Formosa Straits crisis of January 1955 on the Dachen Islands. And the Secretary of State directly told him, this is from a MEMCOM, he said, if you want us to get involved in this issue of the offshore islands, you have to realize that it's going to get you in trouble. It will possibly lead to arguments over UN jurisdiction, which might prompt someone to raise the proposal of a UN trusteeship for Formosa. And then later on the same conversation, he says, the Secretary of State, Dulles, reminds the Taiwan foreign minister, the Chinese foreign minister, he says, the Kefauver substitute resolution was based on the thesis that the United States had established interest only in Formosa and the Pescadores. And this stemmed from the victory of Japan, the victory over Japan, and the fact that Japan had not transferred sovereignty over Formosa to any other country. In other words, this is the Secretary of State of the United States telling the Taiwan foreign minister directly, we did not transfer sovereignty to you. So you better, let's rethink this whole thing. Now, I've gone a little bit over my time, but let me cut to the chase here. This remained, of course, as I said, a central tenet of U.S. policy toward Taiwan through the 60s as we were discussing who was going to be the representative of China in the United Nations. It always came up in Senate hearings. And in 1971, in April 28, 1971, there was this long 8 pages of transcript here, transcript of press, radio, and television on the record, April 28. Mr. Bray, let me pick up where I left off my considered statement this morning. In other words, they were talking about the status of Taiwan. So I was asked specifically why we consider the question of sovereignty unsettled when the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China both say, it's part of Taiwan. Well, we considered it unsettled because of the Taiwan Potsdam declarations. And then he said, let me back up. And let me start over again. 8 pages of this went on. The spokesman for the State Department found it very difficult to articulate it, but the point was there. The United States did not recognize, I think the next one, yes, did not recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. This was a central, I don't know if you all forget that 40 years ago, this past summer, was the famous Kissinger trip to China, the secret Kissinger visit to China, that he flew to Pakistan, Rawalpindi, and then a secret trip to Beijing. In that discussion, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai said, so, what is your point of view on the theory of undetermined status of Taiwan? And then he stops, pauses. He says, oh, maybe it's difficult for you. Dr. Kissinger says, it is. And then you see why Premier Zhou says, well, I've discovered this. You Americans have a difficult time articulating the undetermined status over Taiwan. And Kissinger says, well, I want to formulate my answer with some precision, and I don't have the same clarity of mind as the Prime Minister. Well, this went on. I mean, you should read the whole thing. It's wonderful to read it. But the point is that Kissinger could not bring himself to articulate support for Chinese sovereignty over time. What Kissinger did say was, I'll tell you that the State Department spokesman will not use the term unsettled again. But later that same day, is there another slide? Is that it? Okay, let's go back to later. Okay. You can hear the end of the story in just a second. I will say that Kissinger told Zhou Enlai about Governor Reagan's trip to Taiwan after the announcement had been made. It was in October of 1971. And Kissinger said, well, don't pay attention to Reagan. Reagan doesn't represent U.S. foreign policy. And of course, 10 years later, Reagan did represent U.S. foreign policy. And Reagan actually delivered the 6 assurances to Jiang Jingguo. The fifth of the 6 assurances was, the United States policy on sovereignty over Taiwan has not changed. Now we'll go to the next one. The issue is, even as late as August 16, 2007, the United States was complaining and making representations to the United Nations, complaining about the United Nations term of Taiwan as an integral part of the People's Republic of China. We complained, and finally Ambassador Khalilzad met with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to discuss a range of issues. On the issue of UN language and the status of Taiwan, Ban said he now realized he had gone too far in his recent public. He confirmed that the UN would no longer use the phrase Taiwan as part of China. Well, there are several other telegrams here I'll go into, but the point is that even to this day, the matter of Taiwan's undetermined status is really critical to the United States policies in the Far East. But the United States cannot maintain this position indefinitely, especially if we go back to Ambassador Saito's problems with President Ma Ying-jeou. If Taiwan wants to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan, we are in a difficult position to stop that. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've gone over. Thank you very much.
Now we move on to the next and final speaker. Gordon Chang is also a very great friend of Taiwan. He has been speaking to quite a number of the local communities and has tremendous insight in many issues in East Asia. Gordon is very much of a general person who can take a very bird's eye view of developments. He writes about the Korean Peninsula, about the South China Sea, about China. He actually wrote a book, The Coming Collapse of China. So, and that's indeed a very insightful book on what we can expect in the future. So with that, Gordon, you'll take us into the present and let us know what is happening right now and what we can say about that. Gordon Chang, ladies and gentlemen.
In an ideal world, the 23 million people of Taiwan would determine their own fate. In an ideal world, we would not look back at history, at either the San Francisco Treaty or anything else. In an ideal world, everyone would be free. But we do not live in an ideal world. In the world in which we live, history is all around us. And that's why we talk about the 3 communiques, the 1992 consensus, and yes, the San Francisco Treaty. The San Francisco Treaty, like all treaties, is an agreement between 2 governments. And that's an implicit recognition that governments have the right to determine the future of peoples. In this case, the future of Taiwan. Now, if this were the 19th century, or maybe even the 20th century, the people of Taiwan would have absolutely no say in their future. They would be bystanders to their own fate. And that, for example, is what happened to the people of Hong Kong. London handed the people of Hong Kong to Beijing through the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. People in Hong Kong had absolutely no say in what was going on. It was almost as if they were chattel, as if they were property, as they were handed from Hong Kong's British dependent territory, in other words, a colony of Britain, to a special administrative region of the People's Republic. In other words, another colony. Same thing happened to the people of Macau. So could Taiwan become a colony? Well, as we know, the people of Taiwan live in a democracy. And in survey after survey, no more than 12% of the people of Taiwan want unification. And in almost every survey, that number is in single digits. Yes, single digits. So what happens if the people of Taiwan are determined to remain what they are today, which is the free citizens of a democratic republic? Well, let's recap a little history about the San Francisco Treaty. In one sense, the treaty was ambiguous. Tokyo said it had no sovereignty over the people of Taiwan, but it didn't say who had sovereignty. So this is not just another Sino-British joint declaration where people are handed from one government to another government. Fortunately, the San Francisco Treaty created a blank slate upon which people in the future could write. And that's exactly what happened. So for instance, in January 1964, when the French government recognized Beijing as a legitimate government of China, French President Georges Pompidou said that Taiwan's undetermined status, quote, must be decided by one of these days, taking into account the wishes of the Formosa population into consideration. But it's also a blank slate of the people of Taiwan are writing on. And that's the principle that supersedes the San Francisco Treaty or any other treaty. And that is the principle of self-determination, which, as we've seen throughout history, has been marked by growing acceptance. It goes back centuries, but of course Americans sort of associate the concept of self-determination with President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson espoused this concept in his 14 points, which became synonymous with self-determination. This idealistic statesman, President Wilson, agreed to deals in Versailles that did not respect the principle of self-determination. But the one thing that he did do was that he created a marker, a rhetorical flag. And since then, people have pinned their hopes on this concept of self-determination. Now the concept became accepted, became enshrined in the UN Charter. Now this is important because in the aftermath of the Second Great War of the 20th century, in 1945, this principle was placed at the center of what people in the world believed. At this time, unlike Versailles, the world took this principle to heart as colonialism became unacceptable and as independence movements gained acceptance around the world, but especially in Asia and in Africa. So by the time that the San Francisco Treaty was signed in September 1951, this concept of people deciding for themselves had become too strong to be ignored by the diplomats. And this is why, at the time that the treaty was signed, that diplomats said that the people of Taiwan should have a say in their own future. Now we're in the middle of this very long process where we started where governments had the absolute say over people's lives to the notion that people have their own sovereignty. But unfortunately, we have not traveled through that entire road. So in an ideal world, we would not be in the San Francisco Bay Area today. Well, let me say it another way. In an ideal world, we would not be in the San Francisco Bay Area talking about the San Francisco Treaty. In an ideal world, we would not be talking about history. But of course, as they say, there is this dead hand of history, and it's evident in all the discussions that we have about Taiwan, because you can't talk about the future of Taiwan unless you talk about its past. And there is no greater fabricator of the truth, of the past, than the People's Republic of China. Now, according to Beijing, they say that Taiwan has been part of China from the very beginning. Well, it is true that both Taiwan and China were once ruled by the same set of emperors. That, of course, was in the Qing dynasty. But we got to remember that in the Qing dynasty, China and Taiwan were both colonies of the Qing rulers. And the Qing rulers governed Taiwan for less than a decade, from 1887 to 1895, when Taiwan became a Japanese colony. Now, of course, the People's Republic claims sovereignty over Taiwan, but in fact, they have never ruled it. Now, one can argue, of course, that the Chinese Civil War, which is this great struggle between the Communist Party of China and the Kuomintang, has never been resolved. But of course, that sounds off-key today. And in fact, even the diehards in the Kuomintang and the KMT don't talk like that. People do talk about updated formulations, such as Li Tengwei's 1999 formulation of special state-to-state relations. But whatever formulation we choose to describe the situation, it is clear that there are two states. They have different names, different flags, different anthems. More important, they have two different forms of government, and there are two different peoples. So whatever name we choose, whether we say Taiwan or the Republic of China, Taiwan is a separate state. If we look at the Montevideo Convention of 1933, we can see that Taiwan has all four attributes of what constitutes a state. And they are a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into agreements with other states. Now, significantly, this convention states that the political existence of a state is independent of recognition by other states, which means it doesn't matter whether it's recognized by other states. But Taiwan, of course, is recognized by 23 other countries. Now, most of them, like the United States, acknowledge the fact that China makes the claim to Taiwan, but these countries do not concur that Beijing rules Taiwan. So the bottom line is that the sovereignty of Taiwan belongs to its people. And we can see the progress since the 1980s. The end of martial law in 1987, the first free legislative elections in 1993, and in 1996, the first presidential election. But because authoritarian Beijing looks so powerful these days, democratic Taiwan is shunned in international circles. And countries get a little squeamish when they start to think about what to call Taiwan. Just think about the Little League World Series that just concluded last week in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. The team from Taiwan didn't compete under Taiwan, it didn't compete under Republic of China. It was there as Chinese Taipei. Well, that's ludicrous. But in fact, Chinese Taipei has won more titles than any other team, 17 of them, but it's still not allowed to use its real name. In short, there is confusion about Taiwan's status, and we can see that not only in the Little League, but also in the United Nations, which, as we've just heard, now no longer says that Taiwan is part of China. Now, this unsettled state of affairs, which is one of the legacies from the San Francisco Treaty, means that the world should look to the people of Taiwan to see what they want. It is precisely because there is no clarity about Taiwan's status that the principle of self-determination should apply. So, why won't the community of nations leave this matter up to the people of Taiwan? Well, because everybody is intimidated by Beijing. I mean, 2 years ago, just think about it. Everyone believed that China owned the century. China had the world's fastest growing economy for a major nation. It had the world's fastest growing military for any nation. And there was a growing acceptance of Beijing in global councils. Now, the People's Republic of China doesn't look so mighty. And this means that the world is going to reach two inflection points. First, China, which once looked so strong, once looked invulnerable, once looked like it was going to take over the world, now looks a little fragile. Most people are beginning to see that the Chinese economy is in trouble, with growth slowing fast, inflation accelerating, and a property market bubble that overhangs everything. The problem is that the conditions that created growth in China either no longer exist or are disappearing fast. So, for instance, China's no longer reforming. Matter of fact, it's worse than that. Hu Jintao, the current leader, is presiding over an era that is marked on balance by the reversal of reform. Moreover, China's exports, crucial to the Chinese economy, they boomed in a period of uninterrupted growth, but that period, which started at the end of the Cold War, is over. And finally, China's demographic dividend, which is this enormous bulge in the workforce, is now coming to an end. It's now a heavy demographic tax as the country ages faster than anyone expected. So all of this means that China is headed into a new supercycle, and instead of a supercycle up, it's a supercycle down. And by the way, this deterioration in the Chinese economy is coming at a time when the country's social fabric is fraying, and as we see protests becoming more numerous, but more important, protests are becoming more violent. Now, the second inflection point will be reached when people realize that China's path is not benign. Everybody had fond hopes that China would be integrated into the global community peacefully and that the Communist Party would accept international norms. But those hopes are being dashed. In Asia, we are seeing free nations, including some not-so-free nations, banding together to protect themselves. And this coalition is starting to gain momentum. Now, nations may not talk about the arc of freedom and prosperity, which is what Taro Aso, who was Japanese foreign minister in late 2006, talked about, but that's what they're doing nonetheless. What we are seeing is a ring of nations, from India in the south to South Korea in the north, that are getting together to protect themselves. And this group has, as its protector itself, the one truly mighty nation in the Western Pacific, and that is the United States of America. Washington has been reluctant to confront China, but it's starting to do so because Beijing is leaving us no choice. The Chinese, incredibly, are taking on all their neighbors at once, sending their troops into Indian soil, crashing their vessels into South Korean Coast Guard ships, and harassing unarmed U.S. Navy reconnaissance vessels in international waters. Now, we may not yet have reached the global tipping point of perceptions because our policymakers don't want to face the facts, but we are not far from that happening. What happens when we reach these two inflection points? Well, global opinion will turn against China. We are even beginning to see a new narrative starting. There's a new global conversation about a China that is in turmoil and one that is belligerent. Now, when it's clear that China is not going to be the owner of the century, we're going to see many of its friends desert it. And when that happens, people around the world will get in touch with their better instincts and support Taiwan's aspirations because they will recognize that people in Taiwan should determine their own future. This is something that I'd like to see, but this is something I know I will see. After all, we have seen something in a very similar context. During the Cold War, the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, were part of the Soviet Union. They had lost their independence that they had gained right after the First World War. But the peoples there, they never gave up. And when the world seemingly forgot about their plight, they fought on. These people, they nurtured their own identities, they continued their struggles, they never ever gave up. And today, the people in the Baltics are free. And today, 60 years after the signing of the San Francisco Treaty, the people of Taiwan are also strengthening their identity, they're affirming their nation, and they are not giving up. They will never give up. Soon, the world will recognize that the people of Taiwan have the right to determine their own future. And that means soon, we will be one step closer to an ideal world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gordon, for that very positive note on which to end our presentations. And thanks to all my fellow speakers for their tremendous insights and uplifting information and encouraging words to people of Taiwan and you Taiwanese Americans here in the United States. What we would like to do now is to move to a Q&A session. And I understand there was going to be a microphone also for the audience. But before I get to that part, I'd like to see if any of the speakers had perhaps comments or points on the speeches from